That Triathlon Show, episode 48. Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and today's episode is a solo episode, which is all about running well off the bike in your triathlon races. So we've had a lot of interviews recently, so it's been quite some time since I last did a solo episode. And also, since the interviews have been running a bit long, I haven't even been able to answer more listener questions on the show while in the intros or outros, as I used to do a while back, just because I don't want to make these podcasts run too long. But that said, I have been answering them on emails and on Twitter, so just because you don't hear them on air doesn't mean that you shouldn't keep sending them in. But today I get to one of those listener questions, and it's such a big and important one that it merits an entire podcast episode of itself, and that is how to run well off the bike. Simple question sent in by Clive from Cardiff, Wales. Thank you, Clive, for the question. And as I said, it's a simple question, but we'll take a deep dive into some of the most important variables for when it comes to running well off the bike. And I thought that it would be great to start off by just very, very quickly bulleting out the main points that I will make, and then we'll dive into each one of them in more detail. So the cliff notes, if you want, for this episode is: first, practice. You need to practice running off the bike a lot. And second, pace the run and the bike well. There's a very true saying, in my opinion, that goes bike for show and run for dough. And that's often the way it is in triathlon. Especially for age groupers, many go too hard on the bike, but also for the pros, especially if you look at the Ironman World Championships, that's definitely a case of most pros bike for show and run for dough. Or I should say they do it wrong. They don't adhere to that saying. They go too hard on the bike and then suffer on the run and miss out on the dough. Third, is a biomechanical tip. I don't want to go into too many of those because it has been proven time and time again that running biomechanics is pretty individual. But one thing that has been shown is that when running off the bike, a lot of people lean forward too much at the waist, and this hurts their biomechanics. So don't lean forward, run upright, run tall, as I like to say. And the fourth point is energy and hydration on the bike, also on the run. But if you get to the run depleted on energy and hydration, then you're in trouble, especially in longer races. So make sure you get on top of that. And finally, the fifth point is to get strong on the bike. That will help your running off the bike as well. All right, so first, just a brief background. What happens really when you run off the bike? Why do you go, well, not as fast as you'd like to in these triathlon runs compared to your open runs, open 10Ks, half marathons? And one of the main points is that, of course, fatigue, general fatigue, and in some cases also energy depletion play a big role. But running economy is another factor. And fatigue, again, general fatigue affects running economy. Also, aspects like increased core temperature have a big part to play here. If you have already gotten an elevated core temperature, then it will usually cause you to not get as much benefit from the energy that you get in, that you produce from your oxygen, to what you get out of your running. So that's running economy. It's essentially the cost of the oxygen cost, you could call it. So there have been some studies on it, and one review article by Millett and Vleck in British Journal of Sport Medicine found that the increase in the energy cost of running, or economy cost of running, varies from 1.6% to 11.6% and is a reflection of triathlete ability level. So at the very high end, the increased or reduced economy is very low, 1.6%. But when your abilities decrease, when you go down back to pack, then it increases to a whopping 11.6%, which is a lot. 11% doesn't really sound like a lot. And when we talk about percentages in general in research, you find that something has a 2% benefit. It sounds a little, but when you start doing the maths and calculating how many minutes it may be over an Ironman, it's a lot. And this review study found that most biomechanical parameters are unchanged. So the increased or reduced economy is not because of biomechanical parameters mostly. The one thing they found was, again, as I mentioned, the forward-leaning trunk being the most common issue. So going back again to those reasons why your economy is reduced, it's not biomechanical mostly, but it's fatigue, maybe overdoing the bike, and increased core temperature. ITU athletes suffer little or no loss in efficiency, and you would assume that this goes for long course pros as well. But in ITU studies, athletes, there has been a study that confirmed this and would publish results based on a World Cup race in 2009. So what happens in a nutshell? Your running economy is reduced when you run off the bike for several different reasons, including fatigue and increased core temperature. So let's go into what you should do to reduce the reduction in economy and run better off the bike. Okay, so the first one is practice. You have to practice. And when you get closer to your racing season, maybe 2 months out of your first race at latest, but it doesn't hurt to do this throughout the season, I would say. But you got to practice at least weekly doing brick workouts. It doesn't hurt to do it twice a week. Depends a bit on how much you train, of course. But if you train a fair amount, then twice per week is probably preferable. And make your brick workouts specific with at least, not every single one of them need to be, but a lot of them should have race intensity on the bike, whether it be a continuous kind of race intensity effort or intervals. And the run as well, include some race specific intensity in that brick run. Maybe starting out at 5 minutes at race pace and then going back to a bit slower than race pace, just to make sure that you don't get yourself overly fatigued if you do a lot of training. But you can't do every single brick workout an all-out time trial. That's the point I'm trying to make. But you need to include some race intensity to practice and teach your body how to handle that stress, because it's very different running off a hard bike than running off a very easy recovery ride. And there are a few different opinions. I think that a little goes a long way. So a 10 to 20 minute brick run will give you plenty of stimulus, but for some people it may be useful to do longer bricks. And this is something that we talked about in episode 19 with Eric Schwartz, who is a very good coach and great runner off the bike in triathlons. So he gave the advice that doing long brick runs, and he has found that useful. So that's something to consider trying out as well. Again, my personal preference is doing a bit shorter, 10 to 20, maybe 30 minutes. This is going to depend on the distance you train for, but a little goes a long way is my philosophy. It's not necessarily the only right solution though. Okay, point number 2. Pacing. You should know what you can realistically sustain for the run and have a plan for how to really make sure that you don't run too fast at the start and then fade away, and maybe even have to start walking, especially if it's a long course race. That will be a long day out and you'll lose a lot of time. And there are 2 studies in triathlon that have shown that negative splits in the run portion of the triathlon produce faster performances in both elite triathletes and in well-trained amateurs. And these studies, all the studies that I mentioned, will be linked up in the show notes if I can remember. If not, then send me an email and I'll dig them out for you. I noticed when going through some of my old show notes that I have mentioned in some cases that I'll include links, and I've forgotten some of those links, but I'll do my best to remember all of these references that I mentioned and include them. So those two studies, both of them found that that negative splits in the run portion produce faster performances. So that's something that everybody should shoot for. And even though those studies have been done with really well-trained and above triathletes, I think it's especially important for beginners. I know myself that I could, even though I'm pretty good at negative splitting or doing very even splits, I know that I could, for the Olympic distance, which is my specialty, my favorite distance, I could do a positive split and still run well, just hanging in there for the last 5K and not lose too much time, maybe. But I think for beginners, it's especially important to aim for negative split, because beginners don't necessarily have the same perception of pace and may do too much of a positive split if that happens, and then really, really slow down on the second half. And of course, fitness plays a role here as well. If you fade, you really fade, or even if you bonk. So start conservatively, and if at an appropriate point into your race you feel that you have it in you to push it, then just go for it. But you will feel this, and having trained for it really helps you know when the right time is to push it. So let's talk a little bit. I won't go too much into this, but I want to briefly mention what kind of rough guidelines for intensities and zones or intensity factors that you should be running at for different distances. So for a sprint triathlon, zone 4 or 5 for intermediate and advanced triathletes, definitely an intensity factor if you use training peaks higher than 1, so that's higher than your functional threshold if you're a pretty quick runner, and closer to 1 if you're more intermediate. And a guideline for beginners that might be more useful is 5 to 6% slower than your open 5K time. So if you run your open 5K time, now I'm going to use slightly faster paces because it's easier to do the math. But if your open 5K time is 20 minutes, then 21 minutes would be a 5% difference. And that would be what you could aim for your triathlon 5K. But again, for less fit athletes, the differences might be a bit bigger. So maybe 7 or 8% or something. But the point being that you shouldn't let the differential become too big, because that means that you're either severely undertrained or you have gone too hard on the bike. For an Olympic distance, depending on your ability level, again, high zone 3 to zone 4. So a good piece of advice here would be to start in high zone 3, and but if you're really good, really a quick runner, then you can go right up to around threshold. So an intensity factor of around 100% of your threshold. And again, I think that the 5 to 6% slower than your open 10K holds true here if you're relatively well trained. So this means that if you're a 40-minute open 10K runner, then 42 minutes would be a good time to shoot for in your triathlon 10K with good training. So to give an example of pacing here, and for my American listeners, I have actually made calculations here in mile pace as well for once. So if you're running at a 7-minute mile pace, then you should add, for this 5% difference, 21 seconds per mile. And in kilometer pace, these are not exact equivalent. I just took random paces. But if you're running a 4:30 kilometer pace, then add 13 seconds per kilometer. All right, moving on to a 70.3 or half distance triathlon. So for intermediate triathletes to advanced triathletes, mid to high zone 3, an intensity factor of around 0.9. If you're really advanced, then going even higher towards approaching 95%. For beginners, decrease this slightly, maybe to 85% or 87, 88%. And again, really important here to consider doing a negative split. Start conservatively, especially for those beginners. But I think that 90% of your functional threshold, an intensity factor of 0.9 is a great starting point for most. And in terms of percent, percentage differences compared to open half marathons, a 6 to 10% differential would be a good guideline. So an example here would be if you run a 1 hour 40 minute open half marathon, then you would, with an 8% differential, for example, run a 1:48 half marathon in your 70.3 race. Finally, for Ironman pacing, beginners should definitely limit it to zone 2 or even zone 1. Maybe insert regular walking breaks of 30 seconds or so every 5 minutes. That could be a good option. And for quite a long ways into it, until you really feel certain, then you might be able to increase your pace a bit if you want to. But the point being here, start conservative and then reevaluate, maybe at the halfway point or even later. Remember that a marathon really starts at 30K. That's something that I learned from many years in marathon running. And for advanced athletes, then zone 3 is probably possible to hold, but at the lower end towards your aerobic threshold. Intensity factor guidelines, 75 to 80%. And again, for percentage guidelines, my personal opinion would be to say a 15% differential for the average age grouper. I know that in Triathletes Training Bible by Joe Friel, he has a guideline of 20%. I personally think that seems a bit high, and also looking at some data from races and from just forum discussions on Slow Twitch, for example, that 20% seems high. That, to me, seems to indicate that you have overcooked it on the bike. That would, for example, mean that if you run a 3:30 open marathon, you would add 42 minutes to that, so a 4:12 full Ironman marathon. And it might be, maybe for the beginners, the 20% is realistic, but if you're an intermediate triathlete and have been training decently for your Ironman race, I would say that 15% is better to shoot for. And for the pros, if you consider them, few of them have actually run open marathons, so it's difficult to find any data on this, but my estimate is that the differential between their open and Ironman marathons is probably around 15 minutes or even closer to 10 minutes for some. So even for 15 minutes for a 2:45 Ironman marathon, that is still below 10%, around 9%. And if you get closer to that 10-minute differential, you would get to maybe 7% or so. So that's it for pacing. Pace conservatively with a negative, not necessarily conservatively, but aim for a negative split. If you're a beginner, yes, pace conservatively, in my opinion. Negative splits is good for everybody. And for these zone guidelines, intensity factor guidelines, I will have links in the show notes, or we will mention these in the show notes. And I also have a great table that I link to that has specific times to shoot for, depending on open half marathons and marathons, and what that could translate to in terms of your half distance and full distance run splits. Okay, moving on to the next point, running form when running off the bike. And again, as I mentioned, it has been proven many times over by research that you can't really improve your running economy or your run pace by doing too many active interventions to change your running form. That's not to say that you shouldn't work on running form, but you always want to be careful with dishing out advice on running form. So there's one main point here that I want to bring across when it comes to running off the bike, and that is that many, including myself in some cases, when you run off the bike, you lean forward too much at the waist. And I think one thing that I do regularly, very regularly, is I try to run past a place where I have big windows so I can look at my profile mirror image in those windows when I'm running just after coming off the bike. And that will tell me whether I'm leaning forward, which I shouldn't, or if I'm running upright and running tall. That is my mantra, run tall. And you can use run upright. That you can also try to, I would say that run tall. If you run tall, run upright. If you stick to those mantras, then you will do well. But try to run past windows and look at your mirror image from a profile view in those images to see whether you are leaning forward, because you don't really know it if you are. You think that you're running normally, but just because of having biked before and being being in the biking position, maybe in your aero bars if you're in a tri bike, that makes it difficult to run upright as you should when running off the bike. And then another point on form is just relax. Stay relaxed. Don't tense up. This is especially common to happen in your upper body, your shoulders, your back. Try to relax. Maybe shake out your hands. Let them hang off your side for a bit and shake them out. That will bring some relaxation back into your upper body. And finally, for form, cadence. For some, I won't take a stand here on cycling cadences, although I'll talk about them in a bit. I think that whatever works for you, and as long as you practice your race cadence and your running cadence, you're good. But for the run cadences, what happens when you have too low a cadence is that you tend to overstride and become very inefficient. So I find at least that in my triathlon 10Ks, compared to my open 10Ks, my cadence is probably even higher in triathlon because my hips are a bit tight after biking, so I can't do as long strides as I usually can do, even though I don't overstride. But when running fast, you need to have long strides as well. So I compensate by slightly increasing my cadence and really running like a Duracell machine, if you know what I mean, if you've seen those commercials. But so I just looked at my data from my races from this year and last year. And these are from both sprint and Olympic distance races. And this year, I have been running at cadences 190, 192, 192. And last year, it was 190, 188, and 190. So for my key races, I didn't look at all of my races. But so that is a fast cadence. That's a very fast cadence. And that's something that I think that you should be cognizant of, especially when running out of T2, to try to keep that cadence up. But that means whatever is high for you, relatively speaking. You can't just go straight from 170 to 190 if you're accustomed to running 170. But having that mindset of running at a slightly higher than normal cadence, I think will help your running form and running more efficiently. So the next point on the list for running well off the bike is the bike leg. And there are several things that come into play here. Pacing. Bike for show and run for dough, as I mentioned. You can do a really good bike split, but then if you fall off the pace on the run and really fade and have a poor final time, what's the point of that great bike split? A triathlon is swim, bike, run. It's not have a great swim split and have a great bike split and then just fade to a poor run performance. It's your final time that is a triathlon, and you can't look at these elements in isolation. You need to consider all of them, and if you bike so hard that you have a poor run, then I think that your triathlon performance has been poor as well. If you look at it from a kind of a critical point of view, but when you want to have a good performance, you need to have a good run performance as well, and that means that you can't just overcook yourself on the bike. And this is something that happens so often that I have a pretty strong standpoint on this topic, that so many people overcook themselves on the bike, that this is something that I want to really, really emphasize, that it's okay to have a 2 or 3 minutes slower bike split than normal if that allows you to have a much better run split that more than compensates for that slightly slower bike split. And you'll find that by just slightly reducing your intensity on the bike, the time differential might be very small actually, because it might be that you're actually not going that much slower at all on the bike. So try it out, and remember to bike for show, run for dough, or don't do that, but yeah, do that. I'm always confused by that saying. You should run for dough, so that means having a good run. The next point that I want to make is, I lost my show notes here, 1 second. All right, here we go. Hydration and energy intake on the bike, as well as on the run, but if you're already set up after the bike, then you have that much greater chance of having a good run. And I won't go into detail on this. I will just reference a few episodes that we have on these topics. So those are episodes 40 with Jesse Kropelnicki and 41. The episode 40 was especially as it pertains to half and full distance triathlons, both energy intake and hydration, but in general as well. 41 is also a great one with Ted Munson from Science in Sport. And we talk about both everything from sprint to full distance triathlons and energy and hydration in all those distances. And then the next episode 49, will be on hydration. So that, and sodium in your hydration, that is a teaser for the next one. So make sure you tune in for that, and make sure that you get your energy and hydration right on the bike. Let's talk bike cadence. There's a lot of talk going on about if you have a higher cadence, then you will run better. And I was looking at the studies, and I could find 3 of them. 2 of them found no difference in running performance if you had a higher cadence versus a lower cadence. And all of these studies used 3 different cadences. So a preferred cadence, and then a high cadence, which was, depending on the study, 15 to 20% higher. And then a low cadence, which was 15 to 20% lower than the preferred cadence. Actually, one of the studies fixed the cadence, which it was a 60, 80, and 100 RPM cadence. But the other ones were preferred cadence with either 15 plus minus percent or 20 plus minus percent. So as I mentioned, 2 of them found no difference in overall running performance. However, they found that during the first 500 meters of the run, it was easier to run faster, or the participants ran faster and had a higher stride rate, higher cadence on the run as well, which might be beneficial. You might get into a good groove, and but again, the overall point is that it wasn't shown that the overall runtime would have been any faster with a higher cadence than a lower cadence. The third study, and these first 2 studies, by the way, were by Bernard in 2003, and then by, let me see, Tew in 2005. And I'll link to them in the show notes. I don't think it hurts your run to have a higher cadence, but the question becomes, does it hurt your bike or make you slower on the bike, I should say. So again, this is where practice comes in. See what works for you. Just don't take any single cadence at face value, or any single piece of advice regarding cadence at face value, but see what works for you and what makes you run well. And the third study did find an effect on performance, and that was the one with, they had a 30-minute high-intensity cycling effort at preferred cadence, and also then at 20% faster or 20% slower, and then a 3,200 meter run at race effort, or a time trial essentially, after that bike. And they did find an improved performance with the normal and the high cadence compared to the slow cadence. I don't remember actually which one was faster of the normal and the high cadence, but they were not statistically significantly different. But the 3,200 meter run time averaged nearly a minute faster after those normal and high cadences compared to slow cadence. So that is a big difference. And running cadence was significantly larger as well after normal or slow or high cadences compared to slow cadences. Other than that, not too many things to report on here. Looking at my show notes, this study was done by Gottschall and Palmer. And again, it will be linked to in the show notes. 20% faster and slower cadence on the bike, to put it in perspective, if your preferred cadence is 90, then 20% of that would be 18. So that would be 72 and 108. It's a pretty big difference, but it's in line, again, with the other studies. So it would be interesting to see studies done with just a 10% difference, which I think would be maybe more beneficial, because if your preferred cadence is 90, then you might be able to do 80 realistically, but not 72. I think that's too big of a difference. But those limitations apply to those other studies as well. My point here is that I don't think that you really can say anything about whether cadence is good or bad, or a certain cadence is good or bad for your run based on the available science. But the point is that you should practice and see what works for you. So you can do your own study with an N=1 experiment on yourself. All right, the next point is really, really short. Get strong on the bike. This will help you on the run, period. And it will help you maintain a higher intensity on the run. So the more you train on the bike and train effectively, not just go out and plod along. That will help your running. And the final point is bicycle geometry, and specifically the seat tube angle. This is a study from the Journal of Sports Science by Garside and Doran. And they found that a steeper seat tube angle leads to a more relaxed hip angle. So they tried two different angles for the seat tube, 73 degrees and 81 degrees. And they completed a 40-kilometer cycling race or time trial, and then a self-paced 10K. Sorry, the 40-kilometer bike was it was not a time trial. It was a pretty high-intensity effort, but not a time trial. But then followed by a 10-kilometer treadmill time trial for the run. And they found that the steeper seat tube angle was significantly faster when they had that compared to the 73-degree seat tube angle. And the improvements in performance were most prominent during the first 5 kilometers on the run. Let me see here. I have in my show notes the results, if I can just quickly find them. Yeah, so it was 42.55 for the steep seat tube angle for the overall 10K as an average, and 46.15 as an average for the smaller seat tube angle. So that's a big difference. That's a very big difference, and the p-value here was less than 0.01. So it's clearly a statistically significant difference here. And but then again, in the second half of the race, the differences were much smaller and not statistically significant. The most of the difference came in the first half of that time trial. I'll just look through my show notes here to see if there's anything more interesting from this study. And no differences in physiological variables were noted, although heart rate, stride length, and stride frequency were increased during the 81 degrees condition. Again, easier to maintain a high stride frequency with a higher seat tube angle. And all tri bikes will have a steep seat tube angle already. But if you're doing a draft, this study applies very much to me, because I have a road bike when I do my draft legal racing, which is my primary focus. And I don't have a steep seat tube angle. So if I would have some cash to spare, then for me, getting a draft legal bike with this steeper seat tube angle would definitely be beneficial and give me an advantage on my run. All right, that was it for the tips that I had. Again, just to recap, practice, practice, practice. This is the number one tip. You need to practice running off the bike and do it race specifically. So race intensity on the bike and run. Pace. You need to know what pace you should run and then stick to that pace. Try to do a negative split. If you're a beginner, run conservatively. And remember, bike for show, run for dough. Form. Be careful not to lean forward at the waist after getting off the bike. And look at your profile image when you're running past windows to make sure that you run tall and upright. Energy and hydration on the bike. This is important, but again, go to episodes 40, 41, and the upcoming 49 to learn more about this. Get strong on the bike. Super important. And finally, seat tube angle, which I actually forgot to mention when I did my cliff notes at the front of the episode. But this is a minor point, but for some, like for me, it can be important. So that was a doozy. It took me quite some time to prepare this episode, which makes me silently thankful that I often can rely on my guests to run the show for me. But as I've said before, it's great to use these episodes as an opportunity to deepen my own knowledge and have a good, solid session of going deep, digging deep, and researching these subjects. The show notes, as I mentioned, will have all the details, links, and they will be on thattriathlonshow.com as usual. And I'll link to that cool half Ironman and Ironman pacing table, which I found incredibly useful, and it's kind of not so easy to find. So I encourage you to go and have a look at that. Send me your emails with questions, like we got this question from Clive, and I can answer your questions on the show, make an entire episode of it if needed. My email address is michael@scientifictriathlon.com. That's Michael with a K. Or you can send me a tweet on @SciTriat. And I'd like to once again ask you to share this podcast with your friends. Many of you have already emailed me telling about how you got your entire training group to listen to the show, which it just warms my heart. And I'm thankful to the nth degree to those of you that did that and sent me those emails. So please keep telling your triathlon buddies about it, and even other endurance athletes, because there's a lot of episodes I believe that will benefit any endurance athlete and not just triathletes, but especially runners and cyclists probably. On Monday, we'll have Andy Blow, founder of Precision Hydration, on the show, and we'll talk sweat, sodium, cramping, and of course, hydration. Until then, bike for show and run for dough. And as always, keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.